Welcome back to Extra Literary Affairs, a podcast for the lit curious reader, because why not read a little bit of everything? I'm Jennifer Smith.
And I'm Joey Kelly.
And today we are celebrating yet another episode in our June of Art series with an affair with Zadie Smith and her short story Downtown, which appeared in Grand Union, which was published in 2019. Grand Union was Smith's first short story collection, and it contains new and unpublished stories, some pieces that were in the New Yorker and some that were published elsewhere. Joy, I really loved this collection, and I'm very excited to be talking about Downtown with you today. But before we do that, would you like to share a piece of art that was inspired by the story?
Yes. There is an artist called Osmond Watson, who is a Jamaican artist, and his most well-known painting is called The Lord is My Shepherd. So you'll see that on the screen. I don't remember why I chose that one now, but it was connected to this story somehow. That's how I found it.
I think it's because those Jamaican ladies were strutting down the street in New York City, and that was an image I will not forget, Joey. So that's what was called to mind when you told me about that painting. I picked something adjacent to the story. Days before the pandemic started, COVID-19, I met an interesting gentleman who was from Haiti, who had grown up in Brooklyn and had mentioned Basquiat to me, and I did not know who that was. And then my friend, his name is Maxime, took his hat off and had this huge afro of these beautiful Basquiat curls. The reason I'm mentioning this is that this story from Zadie Smith talks about Basquiat, talks about his hair, talks about being from Brooklyn, and also coming from the Caribbean, being Jamaican, sort of being out of the stereotypical African-American community that came from Africa. And I had that conversation with this very young gentleman about how is this whole race relations thing working out for you? He's like, I'm from Haiti, so I feel separated from all of this history. So it was just very interesting, Joey. The reason I bring this up is I went to look at Basquiat, and I'm like, I don't think you're for me. I love that he exists. I love his story, but he is not for me. Then there was an adjacent piece that was by Keith Haring, also not for me, but slightly more in keeping with what I would understand, who made a painting called A Pile of Crowns for Jean-Michel Basquiat. He painted that in 1988, which corresponds with the year that Basquiat died, unfortunately, at 27. So those are our two paintings, Joey.
So since we haven't read from Zadie Smith before, usually we like to do a little bit of an introduction for anybody else that might not have read her before. Zadie Smith is a British novelist and essayist whose work explores identity, race, class, and belonging with intelligence and wit. So some fun facts about her. She debuted her writing at 24 with White Teeth, and it's one of the most celebrated debut novels in recent memory. She's equally celebrated as a critic with essay collections like Feel Free that are essential reading on culture and contemporary life. And she writes from a genuinely in-between place as a daughter of a Jamaican mother and an English father, educated at Cambridge, living between London and New York, a position that gives her work its distinctive double vision.
I also want to mention last week we spoke about Henri de Balzac, who was born in 1799, and Zadie Smith was born in 1975. So we are jumping very, very far into the future. And she is 50 years old at the time of this recording and has a really brilliant career. I would like to give a summary of the story we read called Downtown. It is set in New York's West Village on the day of Brett Kavanaugh's swearing in to the Supreme Court. A Jamaican woman who is an artist is hosting two of her visiting aunties, and what should be a warm 4-day family fun reunion is really overshadowed by this 24-hour news cycle of Brett Kavanaugh's swearing in. Before that actually happened, they had all of this testimony about some things that came back that was very unsavory from his past. Joy, I don't know if you recall that, but it was not good. It was not a good time in the United States when this was happening. And its coverage just keeps coming up in this story. and into this domestic scene of reunion with her aunts and showing them her beautiful city that she loves. She's also hosting this Austrian painter who lives in a forest in Hungary. She talks about him with such glowing admiration and awe, and he is very unique. We don't really hear much from him, but he is overshadowing some of the thoughts in here. He's a figure who's removed from contemporary American life. He's Austrian and he is living in Hungary, so he is not dealing with the daily 9 to 5 that happens in the United States. It really throws the narrator's own immersion into the culture in sharp relief. She is coming from a very different place. This story uses the contrast between the aunt's old world charm and, hey, we're just here to have a good time, let's not make this difficult. The painter's forest solitude, he's very silent, very removed, very distant. And the relentless churn of the cable news covering this Supreme Court swearing in ceremony really frames a question about how women, and specifically in this case, a Black woman, is supposed to hold herself together amid all the noise, the chaos, all of these social pressures. Woven throughout the story is a sense of mourning for a disappearing neighborhood. They have a favorite local cafe that they go to, and in the middle of the hearings they get an announcement that the cafe is closing down and the whole neighborhood is really upset about it. And then at the moment that Kavanaugh gets approved to be on the Supreme Court, magically the email goes out and the cafe is open and everybody gathers there to sort of drown their sorrows in the new establishment, which is exactly like the old establishment with no explanation as to why it closed down for that time. I just really appreciated the story, Joey. It was beautifully well written. I can recall from personal experience when all of this was happening, she brought back the anger, the disappointment, the shock. All of that came up. But that's not where I want to start, Joey. You picked this story. Thank you so much. Because it starts out with a really strong introduction of this Austrian painter. Not sure where you want to go with that, Joey, but I am curious, how affected were you by the framing of the artist in that story versus the very strong political commentary that she embedded inside that frame?
Well, I think, as you said earlier, he is very isolated and pretty much unaware of all of these circumstances happening because he lives in the middle of the woods or a forest in Hungary. So that's not really his priority. He's not an American citizen, so he doesn't really have a pony in the race, so to speak. So there's not really much of a reason for him. He's not really going to be as affected. I mean, United States, our government does affect the global economy and stuff like that. But for the most part, this one circumstance was not going to really affect him or touch him while he was visiting. But it did make me think of Virginia Woolf and her essay, A Room of One's Own, because we have this Austrian artist who comes in and has a very staunch idea about what an artist or a creative person needs in order to be able to create. And I'll just read a quote. He says, "I don't understand how you can live here and be an artist among all this social noise and all of these people. I myself live in an Hungarian forest," which is also very strange because it's grammatically incorrect, which the narrator notes later in the story that it's an Hungarian forest, which I think is just maybe a way to show that there's distance because this is not his native tongue, and so he is using the wrong article here in the sentence.
Yeah, Joey, I really love that you called that piece out because later she recalls that conversation and she says it felt like his comment was designed to infuriate and enrage her, right? He was like, I don't know how anyone could work in these environments. And it did remind me of something that we talk about here quite often. Do the thing that works for you. Don't yuck on somebody's yum. If it's working for them and it's not for you, that's great. Nobody's asking you to do it their way, or nobody's asking you to do it my way. I just really think she did a good job of bringing that to light, of maybe as she's narrating these scenes and some very peculiar things happen in the story, she says, if I was in a Hungarian forest, I don't get exposed to any of this. This is my universe. This is what I know. This is where I want to be. And if you pluck a person of genius and put them in an environment that doesn't jive with what they're trying to do, wouldn't that be even more harmful? So I just thought that was just a really interesting concept of what is the relationship between your personality, where you choose to do your work. Do you work better in the chaos of humanity? Or do you need to have your earphones on in an insulated room, just doing your work with no distractions? That was really interesting to explore.
Yeah, it seems like location in this story becomes an important aspect because, as we've been discussing, there's a Hungarian forest, then we have New York City, then we have this guy that's at her kid's school that is so much of a better person because he took his family to Papua New Guinea and is completely transformed. Him and his kids now see the world so differently. And then the narrator, or our main character, takes a day or two or however long to travel the eastern seaboard. And so I think it's maybe Zadie Smith's way of explaining that the room of one's own, like Virginia Woolf, looks different for everybody else. So it's not necessary that everyone needs to be in isolation because, as our main character has said, she needs the exposure to the life and the vibrancy of New York City and the diversity of that, whereas the Austrian artist needs absolute isolation and doesn't draw his inspiration from what's around him.
Joey, I appreciate you bringing the character in of the father she sees dropping off his kid at the same school her daughter goes to. She's like, the last time I saw you was exactly a year ago today, and you don't seem like you're transformed. You look exactly like the same stuck up asshole you were before you went on your transformation. So she used that word transformative as a single sentence. I could just feel her eyes rolling and being like, oh, it must be nice. They said they took 3 airplanes to get there and they spent a month away and they had all these adventures. And she's just like, who are these people? I just thought that was really interesting. Joey, I would love to read just a little section that she wrote, which to me was like a love story of sorts to New York City. And 2 of my aunts came to town just in time for Brett to make his case. Being Jamaican ladies of a certain dimension, we took up a lot of sidewalk and enjoyed ourselves thoroughly. We started walking in Harlem and headed downtown, but my aunts still have a habit of making a little note in a calfskin notebook every time they see a glorious individual from the diaspora, and by the time we got to Green Street, they had seen 700 painters, 379 video and conceptual artists, about 800 writers, an infinity amount of musicians, 47 sculptors in various materials, a whole load of doctors and entertainment lawyers, plenty yoga teachers, and so on and whatnot, plus a former president, Lyle Ashton Harris, John Legend, Hilton Als, and Spike Lee himself. And I said, ladies, you're going to wear out those notebooks. So you might as well try and take it all in stride. I loved everything about that passage, Joey. She is saying, you can walk 50 blocks in New York and you are going to see the entire range of humanity. I'm assuming she is embellishing quite a bit about, I saw 800 artists on the way between here and your apartment. It's like, well, you might have. Really appreciated that in the very familiar way. I do remember when I lived in a exotic location and people would come to visit. And I was always like, let me show you the best things. I think she really enjoyed being a tour guide, but she's also like, you're sort of embarrassing me and you're slowing me down. If every single interesting thing you're going to stop and write down in your notebook, we're not going to make it very far. So, Joy, I really did appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that also juxtaposes how easily people in New York and in the surrounding areas who are in New York a lot, how easily jaded they become to everything that's around them. Because usually you see people with their headphones in, unless they're tourists, of course. But if they're from the area, they're not really looking around them. They're not as observant because they're just kind of trying to get to where they're trying to go, like trying to get through crowds if it's in a touristy area and just getting to where they need to be. So I think her aunts not being from New York City force her to look around to be like, oh, there is a lot of stuff going on here. And I think that underscores the need for her to be in this metropolitan environment to find creativity. Because to your point earlier, I don't think if you dropped her in the middle of the Hungarian forest that she's going to find inspiration. We don't know what kind of art she makes. She doesn't really talk about that. It's not really brought up. It seems like maybe she's having a hard time. Maybe she's feeling a little stunted creatively, but I would imagine it reflects the area that she lives in.
Yeah, I think that is a good assumption, Joey. And the social commentary that is woven throughout the entire story, from my sensibility, is done very beautifully, but it also is just punching you right in the face. It talks about what it means to be an American. This Jamaican woman has her green card, and she's like, the next time I come here, I'm going to be a full citizen because why am I not a citizen right now? As you will recall, this is 2018, around that time frame, the brutal killings of African American men caught on camera, and that sort of kicked off that whole Black Lives Matter era that we have gone through and continue to honor. She calls out in her story. She's like, say their names. She's at a Black church and she's like, we're going to say their names. And if you, Joey, can flash back with me about what it felt like to witness these things, it was very powerful. And the distance of time for me did not lessen the impact of the way in which she portrayed what was happening. I think that was really well done. If this story is read 20 years from now, a new generation of children will be reading the story when they're teenagers. Are these names going to be names they know? Or are they going to be so obscure because there's so many of them at this point, even now? Will that diminish, or will the legacy of her writing them down in this creative work also make sure that their voices are never forgotten? I don't know. It's just been very moving.
What I think is very impactful about this story and reminded me of one of the books that was just nominated for the International Booker, The Nights Are Quiet in Tehran, in the way that it is showing what does everyday life look like while you're going through a revolution in your country and all of the fallout from that. And so how do you live a normal life while you're going through political upheaval? And we can see that reflected in this story as well, because I vividly remember the Brett Kavanaugh hearings and being like, what the actual fuck is going on here? Is everyone taking crazy pills? I think they are. And I think Zadie Smith does a good job of exploring, like, we still all had to live every time some horrible political thing happens, and it happens every single day, every single hour at this point in American history. How do we continue to live as normal lives as humanly possible? We still have to do all these mundane things like bringing your kids to school or picking them up and talking to other parents in the line, or your relatives are visiting and so you want to show them the sights, especially because you live in New York City. You have to work. You still have to go to these events that maybe you're not wholly invested in because there are so many other larger issues that are taking up a lot of your mental capacity in your space. I really like stories like that where we get to see that it's not just this giant political issue or it's war or whatever. People still have to survive and continue going on. They still have to somehow balance these two things.
Yeah, Joey, I appreciate you saying that because I'd like to read the passage that I think marries with what you were saying. So this is a quote from Zadie Smith's Downtown. Anyway, by the time we got to the tip of the island, they were in real high racial spirits and didn't mind too much settling into a corner booth and watching the proceedings from Washington on a massive TV hung above the bar. Now, rape is as common in the history of our family as whatever is common in your family is common to yours. So what my aunt said next, I take to have a certain authority. They said, this might look like a war between men and women, but what this really is the last siege of the ruling class. See Brett up there making that little bitch baby face? You see that? That's the face a baby makes when you try and take away his rattle. We've had many, many babies, so we're familiar. America being the rattle in this analogy. He thinks he deserves to do whatever he wants with that rattle, and women are simply a subclause. Whoa, now that's some writing, Joey. And she's calling on the wisdom of her Jamaican family members who have lived a long time, so probably have more worldly experience. And to have somebody proclaim, rape is so common in my family, it's just as common as blue eyes are in Jennifer's family. It's just a thing that happens. What are you going to do about it? Sad but true. That was really affecting to me.
Yeah, I mean, that was obviously brought up in the Brett Kavanaugh hearings about sexual assault. So I think it's poignant to bring that up, that this is a ubiquitous thing to her and her family members and to women in general. I'm not saying that every woman has been sexually assaulted, luckily, but most women probably are aware that it's a potential possibility, unfortunately. So I think bringing that up and saying, like, this was taken as we don't believe victims in these hearings. And so I think it was important for her to note that this is a reality for women. It doesn't make it go away just because we decided to believe this guy so that we can make him a Supreme Court justice, and to ignore the victims who went out on a huge limb and had to testify and all of this kind of stuff when they knew they could potentially not be believed, which is so unfortunately common. Obviously, everything that she was putting in here, I think, was super necessary for the moment, and I think is a good stamp of what were Americans thinking of at the time. Well, not all Americans, obviously, but smarter Americans. What were they thinking about at the time of these hearings? Because I remember texting one of my friends as we were both watching it at our houses, being like, can you believe what just came out of this man's mouth? And can you believe that he is acting and behaving this way? They want to make him a Supreme Court justice? I mean, now I would not blink an eye, obviously. We are very much accustomed to the ridiculousness of this administration. But at the time, I was like, where's Ashton Kutcher and who's pranking us here?
Yes, Joey, indeed. Why was this not just a ridiculous prank that we can walk back and say, just kidding? That's how bad it could have been. But aren't you glad you have sensible people running the country now? Yeah, that didn't quite pan out the way that I had hoped. Joey, I also appreciate she uses a lot of language that reminds me of my home. And she and I have very different lived experiences, obviously. And this little section, I just want to read, Joey, because this is a phrase that my parents would say to me. She's talking about that Austrian painter, which she's really envious of. She's like, he's brilliant. Oh, in social situations, he is painful. He doesn't speak. He just sits there. He makes my kids look like these rowdy, run around, rambunctious children, and his two perfect little twins just sit there quietly waiting for something to happen. She's like, oh, it looks so bad. So she said of the artist, he's the real deal, and therefore, like his daughters, mostly silent. Honestly, it was how I imagine it might be to have Schopenhauer around to tea. An honor and a privilege, sure, but socially, pretty hard work. And I just love that she brings in, when you know somebody's the real deal, my mom would say that all the time, that guy, he's the real deal. He is not messing around. That's a guy who does it. But she was like, even though you're brilliant, you're exhausting because I don't know how to be in your presence because you don't speak. And when you do speak, one of the things that she said about him, and Joey, I love this phrase and I want to read it. When he was talking about living in the Hungarian forest, she said, it was the kind of statement calculated to drive me into a frenzy of self-hatred. So the man makes an offhanded comment about his own life, his own preferences, his own world, and she hears it as a direct attack on the way in which she is existing on this planet. I think one of the interweaving storylines is, how is a woman supposed to live in a world that seems so adversarially against her in so many different ways? She's like, how do I make space for that? And I don't think that's a question that can be answered. It certainly cannot be answered by me for her, but I just thought it was really a well-done story. There is humor in there, Joey. There were some really funny bits. So if anyone has not had an opportunity to read Zadie Smith, it's going to make you mad. A certain type of person's going to get really mad reading this story, but it is so beautifully written. It's not pretentious. It's not stuffy. It's not dumbed down. It's very sophisticated in some ways, but really accessible.
Yeah, I haven't read any of the other stories in Grand Union yet. I do have the ebook version, so I will be reading them. And I haven't read anything else by Zadie Smith yet, but White Teeth, I do know about it. So I definitely will read it soon because I'm curious. I know she's been around for a long time and a lot of people love her. So I'm curious as to the rest of her work because I haven't read it.
Yeah, I just rehoused some of my books, so I know that I have some Zadie Smith behind me. I will say just one interesting pop culture thing that came up for me recently about Zadie Smith and reading her specifically. I was watching a streaming show called Rooster, and the man goes to a small town college and he is teaching these kids how to write. And a very studious sort of front of the class do-gooder raises her hand and he's like, hey, everybody, tell me one of your famous, what writers do you admire? And she's like, Zadie Smith. And Steve Carell's character at that time, he's Rooster, he's like, never heard of him. And everybody just looked at him and was like, you're so clueless. Like, it's not a him. And how are you teaching us the power of beautiful writing in a contemporary America and have no idea who this person is who's winning all these awards and is just really a cultural phenomenon? So I just thought that was really funny. Joey, at least you wouldn't fall for that going like, I don't know who he is. At least you know that she is a British female who is transcontinental. She is in both places all the time.
Actually, that show that I was quoting for our funny month, The Vicar of Dibley, there was an episode where they have a village book club. None of them actually read the book, but they're supposed to read a Zadie Smith book. I don't remember which one it was, though. But that was not the first time I've heard of her, but just funny that she's mentioned in a bunch of shows, so obviously people know about her. She's obviously very famous.
And I love that, Joey, because those are very, very different shows from what I've heard you say. And if you have arrived in your career where people start throwing your name into comedy shows and not in a comedic way, right? They're like, this is a person who exists. You should probably be aware of her body of work. I just really love that. Joey, and one thing that dovetails into the themes that we will be discussing in July is that it does talk a lot about what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to have privilege? What is the purpose of the Supreme Court? She has this beautiful, poetic, visually lovely scene about watching these men in a canoe going down the Potomac, and she sees the Washington Monument in the background. And I was like, this is a moment, right? This is a spiritual awakening for her. She's like, it feels like they just came back from a duel or something. And even though there are all these very noisy, busy, chaotic things happening, she found that moment of peace. She's like, this is symbolic of something, but I'm not sure what. One of the things that we will be talking about as we go forward into the 250th commemoration of our country being founded is what does it mean to be American? What is a founding father? Who are we now and where are we going? A little preview for July, but I just thought it was very interesting that the story sort of bridges the gap. It's like, oh, we're here to talk about art. I'm like, yes, but we're also talking about what it means to be an American, who's welcomed here, who do we need, who don't we want, all of those things.
Yeah, well, let's find out what we're reading in July. It's going to be fun for America's big 250th.
Our big
we
day.
We will not be watching UFC fights, I can tell you that.
And none will break out on this podcast either. I promise there will be no UFC action.
We are not sponsored by UFC, okay.
Joey, because my mind is devious, I was just thinking up what the acronym UFC might stand for.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, it just made me chuckle to myself. So I'll just keep that to myself. I'll tell you later, but it was not kind. It was not a kind thought, Joey.
Yeah, I don't know. United Federation of Combat, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
That sounds legit enough.
So as people who love words and love making up playful phrases, I think that's something that we can chew on. And if there was ever going to be a throwdown, Joey, you and I were going to do our cage match on the podcast. It would probably be around quoting book sources or lines from books. And that is the only point of contention that we generally have. Did you even read the book, Jennifer? I'm like, I'm sure I did because you saw me read it, but I don't know what it was called and I can't remember the author. And you're like, okay, the girl could work on her skills just a teeny little bit. So that is my resolution, to become a bit more proficient by being able to pull out both the actual title and the actual author of the books that we are reading and discussing.
Well, it's not New Year's, but you can set a resolution whenever you want. You're an adult, you can have ice cream for breakfast, and you can have a resolution whatever the hell you want. Thank you so much for watching or listening to today's episode. And if you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe, and follow us on TikTok.
Great. Thanks, Joey. We'll see you next time. Bye.